The smoke alarm never went off. That's the detail I keep coming back to, the one that tells me none of what happened that night was an accident. I woke up because my chest hurt, because I couldn't get a full breath, and by the time I understood why, the hallway outside my bedroom was already swallowed in black. I pulled myself up screaming for my son, screaming for his wife, and what I heard back wasn't footsteps running toward me. It was my son's voice, flat and fast, yelling at his wife to get the truck registration and the deed box from the office safe. Nobody said my name. Not once. And when I finally got my door open and saw the two of them already at the bottom of the stairs with their arms full of folders and a fireproof lockbox, my son looked up at me standing in the flames and smoke on the landing above him and said, "Dad, the stairs are gone. There's nothing we can do," and walked out the front door. Thank you for spending this time with me. Before I go further, I want to say something to whoever is listening tonight, wherever you're tuning in from. Some names and details in this story have been changed, and a few moments are shaped for the telling, but the heart of what happened is true, and I think a lot of you are going to recognize pieces of it in your own lives. If you're the kind of person who believes family is supposed to mean something, stay with me. I read every comment you leave, and I promise you, this story earns its ending. My name is Walter Kessler. I was 68 years old on the night my house burned down in Millbrook, Ohio, a town about 40 minutes outside Columbus where I'd lived for 31 years. I built that house with my own hands, most of it anyway, hired out the parts I wasn't fool enough to attempt myself. My wife Doris and I raised 2 children in that house. Our son Gary was 41 the night of the fire. Our daughter Renee had been gone 12 years, but I'll get to that. Doris passed 6 years before the fire, cancer that took her slow and then all at once, the way it does. After she died, Gary and his wife Kayla moved into the house with me. Gary said it made sense, said an old man shouldn't be alone in a place that size, said they'd help with the bills and the upkeep. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because grief makes you generous with your trust in ways you don't examine closely enough. What I didn't understand yet was that Gary had been doing the math on that house since before his mother's funeral flowers wilted. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 acres, paid off free and clear, appraised at just under $600,000. Gary worked in commercial real estate. He knew exactly what that house was worth, down to the dollar, long before I ever thought to ask. The fire started in the garage, the fire marshal told me later, from an electrical fault in an extension cord that had no business being run the way it was run, snaking through a cracked window to power a space heater in an unheated storage room. I never used that space heater. I didn't even know it was out there. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because on the night itself, all I knew was heat and smoke and the sound of my own son telling me there was nothing to be done, and then the ceiling above the stairwell groaning like something alive. And then it came down, and it caught me across the shoulder and back, and drove me down onto the landing floor, pinned beneath a beam and a sheet of collapsed drywall. My right arm bent under me, in a way arms are not supposed to bend. I lay there, and I listened. That's the part I've never told anyone in full, not even the therapist I started seeing after. I lay there with my face pressed against carpet that was already curling and blackening at the edges, and I listened to my son's truck engine turn over in the driveway. I listened to it idle for 11 seconds. I counted them. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, because counting was the only thing keeping the animal panic in my chest from taking over completely. And then I listened to the tires pull away down the gravel drive. They did not call 911 from the house. I found that out weeks later, from the fire department's own incident log. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. from a cell phone registered to Kayla, and the caller ID location placed it 2 miles down the road at the Marathon gas station on Route 9. My son and his wife stood in a gas station parking lot and called in the fire from a safe, comfortable distance, after they were already gone, after they'd already decided there was nothing worth going back for. What saved me was a stranger. His name was Marcus Delgado, 34 years old, a long-haul truck driver who happened to be pulling his rig into a gravel turnout across the road to check a tire strap when he saw the flames lighting up the tree line. He didn't know me. He didn't know anyone in that house. He just saw a fire and a truck peeling out of the driveway, going the wrong direction, away from town, away from help, and something about that struck him as wrong enough to stop his rig, climb the fence, and run straight at a burning house instead of away from it. He told the deputies later that he heard me before he saw me, a sound he described as knocking, weak and irregular, coming from somewhere above the front door. He kicked it in. He said the smoke dropped him to his knees almost immediately, that he crawled the last 15 feet on his stomach, with his shirt pulled up over his nose and mouth, and that when the flashlight from his phone finally found my face, I was already starting to go under, my eyes rolling back, my knocking slowed to almost nothing. I don't remember him lifting the beam off my shoulder. I don't remember him dragging me across that floor or getting me down what was left of the stairs. What I remember is the cold. Ohio, in November, and I came back to myself lying on wet grass with this stranger's jacket balled up under my head and his hands pressing hard against a wound on my scalp I didn't know I had. And he was saying my name, except he didn't know my name yet. So he was saying, "Sir, stay with me. Sir, help is coming," over and over in a voice that had exactly the kind of steady calm you'd want from a man holding your life together with his bare hands. The volunteer fire crew arrived 9 minutes after the gas station call. By then, Marcus had already gotten me 40 yards clear of the structure, out past where the heat could reach us, and he stayed kneeling beside me the entire time, refusing to let the first responders take over, until he'd told them exactly what he'd seen. The truck leaving, the direction it went, the fact that nobody else had come out of that house except the 2 people already long gone. They flew me to Ohio State's burn unit in Columbus by helicopter. 2nd and 3rd degree burns across my back and shoulder, a fractured collarbone, smoke damage to my lungs that the pulmonologist said would take the better part of a year to fully resolve, if it ever fully resolved at all. I was 71 days in that hospital, though I didn't count them the way I'd counted the seconds of my son's truck idling in the driveway. Those 71 days blur together now into a single long gray stretch of ceiling tiles and IV poles, and the particular loneliness of a hospital room where the phone never rings, because it didn't ring. Not once. Not from Gary. Not from Kayla. I gave the hospital's social worker my son's number the first morning I was lucid enough to speak, and she told me 2 days later, with the careful gentleness people use when they're about to tell you something that will hurt, that she'd left 3 messages and gotten no return call. What I didn't know yet, lying in that hospital bed, was that Gary and Kayla had already told everyone in Millbrook I was dead. Not right away. That took them 2.5 weeks to arrange properly. Because you can't just announce a death, you have to build a story around it. And Gary was thorough about it in the same cold, methodical way he was thorough about everything with a $sign attached. He told our neighbors, told the men at the hardware store, told my old poker friends down at the VFW, that his father had died at the scene, that the smoke had gotten me before anyone could reach me, that by the time the truck driver found me, it was already too late. He held a memorial service at Millbrook Baptist, the church Doris and I had attended for 3 decades, and by every account I later gathered, he cried at the podium and told a room full of people who had known me my whole life that his father had died a hero, trying to save family photographs from the flames. There was no body, of course. There couldn't be, because I was 2 hours north in a burn unit with a tube down my throat. But grief makes people generous with their disbelief the same way it made me generous with my trust. And nobody in that church thought to ask the obvious question, because who lies about their own father's death? I'll tell you exactly who. A man standing at the edge of a paid-off $600,000 property with a fire insurance policy and a homeowner's death that conveniently cleared every legal obstacle standing between him, ownership. The insurance claim went in 9 days after the memorial. Total loss on the structure, full replacement value, plus a life insurance policy on me that I'd taken out decades earlier and never once thought to update or cancel. A policy worth $240,000, with Gary listed as sole beneficiary since Doris passed. He filed for that too. Filed for it while I was still listed on a hospital chart 2 hours away as a living patient in stable but critical condition. I found all this out slowly, in pieces, over the weeks that followed, mostly because a hospital case manager named Louise took an interest in my situation that went well beyond her job description. Louise was the one who noticed nobody was visiting, who noticed the emergency contact number on my intake form, rang and never got returned, who eventually did something I will be grateful for until the day I actually do die. She called the Millbrook Fire Department directly to ask why family hadn't been notified of a patient in critical condition, and the dispatcher on the other end got very quiet and then said, "Ma'am, we have that man logged as deceased." There was a service. Louise called me into a private consultation room that same afternoon, sat down across from me, and asked very carefully whether I was aware that my son had told the town I had died in the fire. I remember the exact sensation of hearing that sentence. It wasn't shock, not really, not the way you'd expect. It was more like watching a picture I'd been squinting at finally resolve into focus. All those years of small warning signs, Gary's questions about the house's appraised value, the way Kayla had started referring to when this becomes ours at family dinners, the life insurance paperwork Gary had helpfully reviewed for me 2 years earlier, snapping together into a shape I should have seen much sooner. I didn't cry in that consultation room. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect tears at a moment like that, and I didn't have any to give. What I had instead was a kind of stillness, cold and clear, the same stillness I imagine a surgeon must feel looking at an X-ray before the first incision. I asked Louise for a pen and paper, and I started writing down everything I could remember, every date, every name, every detail, because some part of me already understood I was going to need it. Marcus Delgado came to see me 11 days after he pulled me out of that house. He'd gotten my hospital information from the fire department and driven 2 hours out of his route on his day off, still in his work boots, carrying a gas station coffee and looking uncertain in the doorway, the way people look when they're not sure they're welcome. "I just wanted to see you were still here," he said. "Nobody would tell me anything after they took you, and I kept thinking about it." I told him to sit down. I told him what I'd learned about the memorial, about the insurance claims, about the messages that never got returned. I watched his face change while I talked, watched something harden behind his eyes that hadn't been there when he walked in. "They told the whole town you were dead," he said. Not a question, just him saying it out loud to make it real. "While you were right here. Seems that way," I said. He didn't say much after that, just sat with me a while, the way you sit with someone after a piece of bad news finishes landing. But he came back 3 days later, and then the following week, and it became a pattern neither of us planned out loud. He was based out of a trucking company in Zanesville, and his routes ran him near Columbus often enough that he started scheduling his rest stops around visiting hours. His wife Priya came with him the third time, a soft-spoken elementary school teacher who brought me a paperback novel and a container of homemade dal because, she said, hospital food was a crime against humanity, and she wasn't going to stand for it. "I want to tell you about Priya's dal because it matters to what comes later. She made it with a particular blend of spices her grandmother had taught her, and the first time I tasted it, sitting up in that hospital bed with a fork in my working hand, I had to set it down and look out the window for a minute, because it smelled almost exactly like the curry Doris used to make on Sunday evenings, a recipe she'd picked up from a coworker decades earlier and never written down anywhere, just carried in her memory and her hands. I hadn't smelled anything close to it in 6 years. I didn't say anything about it that day. I just ate the whole container and thanked her and let it sit in some quiet corner of my chest. Their daughter Nadia was 7, and she came along on weekend visits once Priya decided the hospital wasn't too grim for a child to handle in small doses. Nadia had her father's directness and her mother's watchful patience, and she treated my hospital room like an interesting new country to explore rather than a sick room to fear. She asked me blunt questions nobody else would ask. Did it hurt? Was I scared? Did I miss my old house? And she asked them, without any of the careful, softening adults' use, which somehow made them easier to answer honestly. "My dad says you got left behind," she told me one afternoon, swinging her feet from the visitor chair, her chin barely clearing the tray table. "That's not fair. You're not supposed to leave people behind." "No," I agreed. "You're not. When I grow up, I'm going to be a firefighter like the guys who fixed the roof of our school," she informed me, entirely unrelated and entirely certain, the way 7-year-olds move between subjects. Or maybe a vet. I haven't decided. I told her both sounded like fine choices, and she nodded seriously, satisfied, and went back to coloring on the back of a discharge form the nurses let her have. She started bringing me drawings after that, folded into quarters and pressed into my hand like classified documents. Stick figures under yellow suns, a dog she said she wanted but wasn't allowed to have yet, and one, about a month in, of 3 tall figures and 1 small one, standing in front of a house, holding hands, the small figure labeled Nadia in careful 7-year-old handwriting, and the tallest figure in the middle labeled Grandpa Walt. Nobody had told her to call me that. She'd simply decided it on her own and never once asked permission. I still have that drawing. I'll always have that drawing. The weeks passed, and my body slowly began doing what bodies do, knitting itself back together in the stubborn, unglamorous way. Healing actually happens. Nothing like the movies, mostly just grinding physical therapy and skin grafts, and a persistent cough that took months to fully clear. Marcus and Priya never missed a week. Somewhere in there, without either of us naming it out loud, the visits stopped being about checking on the man he'd pulled from a fire and became something closer to just family checking on family. It was during one of those long, unhurried afternoon visits, Priya sitting in the corner chair grading a stack of second-grade spelling tests, while Marcus and I talked about nothing in particular, that I noticed something on her forearm as she reached up to push her hair back. A small, faint scar, almost invisible unless the light hit it right, running in a thin, curved line just below her elbow. I'd seen that exact scar before, not on Priya. On my daughter Renee, when she was small, from a fall off the swing set in our backyard when she was 4 years old, a scar Doris used to trace with her thumb sometimes when Renee sat next to her on the couch, an old unconscious habit of a mother's hands. I told myself it was nothing. Scars like that aren't uncommon. Children fall off swing sets everywhere, every year, all across the country. But something in me had already started paying closer attention than I let on. The way you do when a thought is too large and too fragile to say out loud before you're certain. I need to go back and explain about Renee, because you can't understand what happened next without understanding what I lost 12 years before the fire. Renee was our oldest, 4 years older than Gary, and from the time she was small, she had her mother's directness and her own fierce, independent streak that sometimes put her at odds with both of us. She left home at 19 after a fight with her mother that none of us ever fully recovered from. A fight about a boy Doris didn't approve of and money Renee wanted that we wouldn't give her. The kind of ordinary family fight that becomes extraordinary only in hindsight, only once you understand. It was the last real conversation you'd ever have with someone. She called, twice, in the first year. Then the calls stopped. We hired an investigator 18 months in, spent money we didn't entirely have to spend, and he tracked her as far as a shelter in Cincinnati, and then lost the trail entirely. Doris wrote her letters for years afterward, addressed to nowhere in particular, and kept them in a shoebox in her closet. Letters Renee would never read, because Doris didn't know where to send them and needed to write them anyway. Doris died still asking about her. It was one of the last things she said to me with any clarity. In the hospice bed, her hand papery and light in mine. Find her, Walter. Tell her I never stopped. I never did find her. I'd made peace, or told myself I had, with the idea that some doors close and don't reopen, that some grief you simply learn to carry rather than resolve. And then I was lying in a burn unit bed watching a truck driver's wife grade spelling tests, looking at a scar on her arm that matched a scar I hadn't thought about consciously in years, and something in my chest that I'd carefully sealed shut a long time ago cracked open half an inch. I didn't say anything that day. I want to be honest with you about how careful I was, how afraid I was of being wrong, because I had already been wrong about so much in my life, wrong about my son, wrong about what family was supposed to mean, and I did not think I could survive being wrong about this too. So I watched. I asked small questions, sideways, careful, the kind of questions that don't sound like anything if you're not listening for what I was listening for. I asked Priya once, gently, where she'd grown up. She told me she'd been raised by an aunt in Dayton from about the age of 8, after her mother wasn't able to take care of her anymore, a phrase she delivered with the practiced flatness of someone who'd said it many times and stopped letting it hurt out loud. Before that, she said, was mostly a blank. A few scattered memories, a porch swing, a woman's voice singing something she could never quite place. She didn't know her birth name for certain. The paperwork from that period was a mess, she said. Records lost or never properly filed, common enough in the foster system that nobody had thought it worth chasing down. Priya, I should say, is a name she chose for herself at 19, after a college friend's grandmother, because she said she'd never liked the name on her paperwork and wanted something that felt like hers. When she told me that detail, offhand, unimportant to her, I had to ask her to repeat what her paperwork name had been, and she said it slowly, Unbothered. Rachel. Rachel Combs, apparently. Though I don't know if Combs was even real or just something a caseworker wrote down. Renee's middle name was Rachel. It had been Doris's mother's name. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in that hospital bed running numbers in my head. The year Priya said she'd been 8 and lost to the system. The year Renee disappeared. The geography. Cincinnati to Dayton being less than an hour apart. Close enough that a runaway 19-year-old struggling and unable to care for a child could plausibly have ended up in either city, could plausibly have made a decision in a moment of desperation that changed the whole shape of 2 lives. I didn't say a word to Priya for another 3 weeks. I needed to be certain, or as certain as an old man in a hospital bed could make himself, before I opened a door that could not be closed again if I was wrong. What finally broke it open was smaller than I expected. Nadia brought me a school photo one Saturday, proud of her new haircut, and in the photo she was smiling. That particular lopsided smile, where the left corner of her mouth lifts slightly higher than the right, before the rest of her face catches up. I had seen that exact smile 1,000 times. Doris used to say it was the one thing Renee got entirely from her. That same crooked, private half-smile. And I'd seen it again on Nadia without letting myself register what I was seeing until that photograph put it in stillness, in focus, undeniable. Priya, I said, when she came in that evening, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand why I'm asking before you answer. I told her everything. About Renee. About the fight, the running away, the investigator. Doris's letters in the shoebox that never found an address. About the swing set scar, the middle name, the crooked smile that had just walked through my door in a school photograph. I watched her face while I talked, watched the careful composure she wore like armor start to come apart at the seams, her hands going still around the coffee cup she was holding. I need you to go home, I said, and look for anything you might still have from before the aunt in Dayton. Anything at all. A photograph, a piece of jewelry, anything that survived. She came back 4 days later, not with Marcus this time. Alone, carrying a small cardboard box that had clearly been through several moves and several decades, water-stained at one corner, and she set it on my hospital tray table without a word and stepped back like she couldn't quite bring herself to open it herself. Inside was a single photograph, faded and creased down the middle, of a woman on a porch swing holding a laughing toddler, and a thin silver bracelet, tarnished nearly black, with a small engraved heart charm hanging from it. I knew the bracelet before I picked it up. Doris had bought 2 of them, identical. The Christmas Renee turned 6, one for herself and one for her daughter, so they'd match. Doris wore hers until the day she died. It's in a drawer at my house right now, or what's left of my house, because nobody thought to take it during the fire, because nobody was thinking about anything except a filing cabinet and a fireproof box. I held that tarnished little bracelet in my one good hand, and I looked up at this woman standing at the foot of my hospital bed, 36 years old, a school teacher, a mother, a woman who had spent her whole life not knowing where she came from. And I said the only thing I had left in me to say. Renee, I said, your mother called you Sunbug, because you used to fall asleep in patches of sunlight on the kitchen floor when you were a baby and refused to move for anything. She made a sound I don't have a word for. Not quite a cry, not quite a laugh. Something underneath both of those things. Something that had clearly been waiting a very long time, with nowhere to go. Marcus came in the door right behind her. I found out later he'd been sitting in the hallway the whole time, giving her space, close enough to catch her if she needed catching, and he took one look at both our faces and understood everything without a single word being spoken. We stayed like that a long time, the 3 of us, and later Nadia, once Priya called her in from the family waiting area and simply said, Nadia, honey, come here. I need to tell you something about your grandma. I am not a lawyer, and everything I did over the following months I did as a grieving, furious old man with a legal pad and a lot of time in physical therapy waiting rooms, not as some kind of mastermind, but I had one enormous advantage Gary never accounted for. I was still alive, and the law does not particularly care how inconvenient that fact is for the people who told everyone otherwise. Marcus helped me file the public records requests once I was discharged, because he understood incident reports and knew exactly which department to call and what to ask for. The fire marshal's full report confirmed what the volunteer captain had already told me informally. Origin in the garage, an extension cord run through a cracked window to power a space heater that had no permit and no business being there. Installed. According to the hardware store receipt Marcus tracked down with a little digging, 6 weeks before the fire, purchased on Gary's credit card. The 911 call log confirmed the timestamp and the location, 2 miles away at the Marathon station, called in after they'd already left. The responding officer's report noted, in the flat language police reports always use, that homeowner's son and daughter-in-law were present on scene upon officer arrival, but stated they had already evacuated prior to fire department response and were unaware of any other occupants remaining inside the tenor. Structure. Unaware. My son told a police officer, standing in a gas station parking lot 2 miles from his burning childhood home, that he was unaware his own father was still inside. The hospital's own admission records, which Louise, the case manager, helped me formally request, showed the exact date and time I was flown in. 71 days of continuous inpatient treatment, a next of kin contact field listing Gary's phone number, and a visitor log showing exactly 0 visits from anyone by that name across the entire stay. The memorial service was harder to document formally, but Millbrook is a small town, and small towns, remember. I didn't need much beyond a program from the service itself, which one of Doris's old church friends still had tucked in a drawer and gave me without hesitation once she understood what she was looking at, her hand pressed over her mouth the whole time she read it, tears standing in her eyes at the sheer scale of what had been done to a man she'd known for 30 years. The insurance claims took the longest to pull together, but a friend of Marcus's from his trucking days had a cousin who worked claims adjustment for a different carrier and knew exactly how to walk me through the public filing process for a claim that had, as it turned out, already been flagged for internal review the moment the insurance company's own investigator noticed the timeline didn't add up. A death claim filed on a man who, according to a hospital 30 miles away, was still very much breathing. I moved into a small rental house 8 minutes from Priya and Marcus's place once I was discharged, close enough that Nadia could ride her bike over on weekends, which she did, constantly, usually with a new drawing or a complaint about her homework or, once, memorably, a jar of tadpoles she insisted I needed to see immediately. I spent 5 months in that rental house building a folder that grew from a legal pad into a genuine binder, 3 inches thick by the end, everything dated, everything sourced, everything true. Gary and Kayla, meanwhile, had moved forward with their lives exactly as planned. The insurance payout on the house cleared. They used part of it, I learned, as a down payment on a new build in a nicer part of the county, 4 bedrooms, a pool. The kind of house Gary had probably been picturing since before his mother's funeral. Gary quietly changed the beneficiary paperwork on nothing else. Because he didn't need to, he'd already collected what the life insurance policy owed him, $240,000 paid out to a beneficiary for a death that had never actually happened, which is not an insurance mistake. It is insurance fraud. A fact I made very sure to have confirmed in writing by an attorney before I did anything else. The occasion I chose was Millbrook Baptist's annual spring homecoming service, the biggest gathering the church held all year, the one where half the town who'd drifted away over the years came back for a single Sunday to see old faces. Gary and Kayla always attended. It was good for appearances, good for the new social circle they were cultivating in their new house in their new neighborhood, and I knew, because Louise's replacement case manager had quietly confirmed it for me through a mutual church contact, that Gary had specifically requested to give the closing remarks that year, a kind of testimony about resilience and faith through hardship. My hardship, my death, as he understood it, still being useful to him even a year and a half later. I walked in through the side door during the greeting hymn, before Gary took the podium, with Marcus on one side of me and Priya on the other, and Nadia holding my hand because she had absolutely refused to be left behind for this, informing me with total seriousness that grandmothers and grandfathers do not get left out of important family moments, not on her watch. I want to tell you what that room sounded like when I came around the side aisle into full view of the congregation. It wasn't screaming. It was something quieter and stranger than that, a kind of collective intake of breath that seemed to suck all the sound out of the sanctuary at once. 300 people, mid-hymn, simply stopping, one by one, as heads turned and the ripple of recognition moved backward through the pews like a wave finding shore. The organist's hands slowed and then stopped entirely on the keys. Kayla saw me first. I watched the hymnal slide out of her hands and hit the floor of the pew with a sound like a gunshot in that silence. I walked up the center aisle with my cane because my leg still wasn't entirely right and probably never would be, and I did not hurry because I had waited a year and a half for this particular walk and I intended to take every step of it. Gary was already standing near the podium, dressed for his testimony, and I watched his face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. Watched the blood leave it entirely. Watched him grab the edge of the podium, the way a man grabs something solid when the floor has stopped being reliable. I didn't go up on the platform. I stopped at the front pew, turned to face the congregation instead of him, and I spoke without a microphone, because I didn't need one, because a room that's silent carries a voice just fine. "My name is Walter Kessler," I said. "Most of you know that. Some of you sat in this room 14 months ago and heard my son tell you I died trying to save family photographs from a house fire. I want you to know the truth of what actually happened that night, because you deserve it, and because I have spent a year proving every word of what I am about to tell you." I told them. I told them about the extension cord and the space heater purchased on Gary's card 6 weeks before the fire. I told them about the 11 seconds his truck idled in the driveway before it pulled away. I told them about the 911 call placed from a gas station 2 miles down the road after they had already left me. I told them a stranger named Marcus Delgado, standing beside me, a man none of them had ever met, had run into a burning house to save a life my own son had already decided wasn't worth saving. I watched faces in those pews go through exactly what Louise's face had gone through in that consultation room, that same slow, sick resolving of a picture into focus. I watched Doris's old church friends start to cry. I watched men Gary had grown up alongside, men who'd been pallbearers at a funeral for a man who wasn't dead, sit back in their pews like they'd been struck. I am not here for revenge. I told them, though I understood, and understand now, that plenty of people watching this and hearing this later will believe exactly that, and I have made peace with that too. I am here because a memorial was held for me while I was breathing in a hospital bed 30 miles away, and I think that deserves to be corrected in the same room where the lie was told. I turned, finally, to look at Gary directly. He hadn't moved from the podium. Kayla had her hand pressed over her mouth, exactly the way I imagine I must have looked in Louise's office all those months ago, watching a picture resolve into a shape you can't unsee. "The insurance fraud investigation is already underway," I said. "That part isn't mine to finish. That belongs to people whose job it is to finish it. What's mine to say is simpler than that. You had a father who was inconvenient to you the moment he became less valuable than a filing cabinet. I hope the house was worth it." Then I turned to the congregation one more time, because there was one more thing I needed them to see, the thing I'd actually walked in there to show them. More than any confrontation, more than any accounting of fraud and lies, "I also want to introduce you to my daughter," I said, and I felt my own voice finally catch on something. After all those months of careful, controlled documentation, after all that cold clarity, it finally cracked wide open standing in that sanctuary. Renee Kessler. Some of you remember her. She left home 12 years ago, and none of us knew where she'd gone, including her. I found her again this year, 30 miles from where I nearly died, in the last place on earth I ever thought to look. Priya stepped forward from beside me, and I watched 300 people who had known Renee as a teenager, who remembered a 19-year-old girl who ran and never came back, look at a 36-year-old school teacher, and slowly, disbelievingly, start to see her underneath. I told them about the bracelet, about the crooked smile, about a swing-set scar and a mother's shoebox of unsent letters that Renee got to finally read, every single one, the week after I found her, sitting on my rental house floor with the box open between us, both of us crying in a way neither of us tried to hide from the other. Nadia, 7 years old, entirely unbothered by 300 adults staring at her, tugged my sleeve at exactly that moment and said, loud enough for the front 3 pews to hear clearly, "Is this the part where you tell them about the drawing?" I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed out loud in front of other people since the fire, and it broke something loose in that room, some of the unbearable tension finally finding somewhere to go. a ripple of startled, grateful laughter moving through the pews. "Yes," I said. "This is exactly the part where I tell them about the drawing." I told the church that a little girl who had known me for less than 2 months had drawn a picture of her family and put me in it without asking anyone's permission, had started calling me Grandpa Walt before either of her parents thought to correct her, and that a man who had known me for exactly 0 minutes had climbed through a fence and run into a burning building because leaving someone behind never once crossed his mind as an option. I lost a wife to cancer and a daughter to a fight neither of us ever got to fix, I said. I lost a house to fire and, if I'm honest, I lost a son to greed long before that fire ever started. But I want every person in this room to understand something, because I've had a long time lying in hospital beds and rental houses to think about it. Family was never the house. It was never the money in that fireproof box my son valued more than his own father's life. It's a stranger who runs toward you instead of away. It's a child who draws you into her family without being asked. It's your daughter's letters finally getting an address to go to. 12 years too late for her mother to see it, but not too late for the rest of us. Gary left the sanctuary before I finished speaking. I heard the side door swing shut behind him. Kayla stayed frozen in the pew a moment longer, and then she left too, and I let them go, because there was nothing left for either of them to say that I needed to hear. And I understood, walking out of that church an hour later, with Nadia's hand back in mine, that I had gotten exactly what I came for, which was never really about them at all. The insurance fraud case moved through the system the way these things do, slowly, with more paperwork than drama. And I won't pretend to you it ended in handcuffs and sirens, because real accountability mostly looks like settlement agreements and repayment plans and a formal record that follows a person around for the rest of their life, whether the neighbors ever hear about it or not. Gary lost his real estate license over it eventually. That part I did feel something about, and I won't pretend I didn't. I used a portion of what came back to me, once the fraud was untangled and the legitimate insurance money was finally released to its rightful owner, to do two things. I put a down payment on a modest 3-bedroom house 11 minutes from Priya and Marcus, close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough that everybody kept their own front door. And I started a small scholarship at the community college in Renee's name, for kids aging out of the foster system with nowhere obvious to land, because I understood by then, better than I ever had before, exactly how much difference an address that keeps you can make in a life that's spent years without one. Nadia takes piano lessons now on Tuesdays. I pay for those too, though she doesn't know that yet, and I'd appreciate you not telling her. She's not bad. She's not going to be a concert pianist, but she plays with the same total, unembarrassed commitment she brings to everything. And some Sundays after dinner she sits at the little upright I bought secondhand and plays whatever she's learned that week, while the rest of us sit in the next room, pretending not to listen closely. People ask me sometimes, now that enough time has passed for people to ask this kind of question comfortably, whether I've forgiven my son. I tell them the truth, which is that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing, and I've made my peace with one of those without needing the other. I don't know where Gary and Kayla live now. I don't ask. Some doors, once you understand fully what was behind them, don't need reopening. What I know instead is this. I know what Marcus's hands felt like pulling a beam off my shoulder in a burning house he had no reason to run into. I know what Priya's doll tastes like on a Sunday, and I know now why it tasted so much like something I'd lost. Because grief and love sometimes travel the same roads without either of us knowing it at the time. I know what it feels like to be called Grandpa Walt by a child who decided that for herself, and I know what it sounds like when a daughter you thought you'd lost forever says your name out loud for the first time in 12 years. Standing in a hospital room with a tarnished silver bracelet between your two hands. If you're listening to this tonight, and somewhere in your own life there's a door you've been afraid to knock on because you're scared of what you'll find, or scared of finding nothing at all, I want to tell you what I learned lying on that landing floor counting the seconds of a truck engine pulling away. You do not get to choose who runs toward you and who runs away. You only get to choose what you do with the ones who stayed, and whether you have the courage, when the moment finally comes, to walk back through the door that was closed on you and tell the truth about what happened there. That's what I did. That's what this has all been. Not a story about a fire, not really. A story about who came running and who didn't, and what you build afterward with the people who did. If this reached something in you tonight, I'd ask you to sit with it a minute before you scroll on. Tell me, in the comments, who in your life is the one who ran toward you when it counted? I read every single one of them, and I promise you, on nights like tonight, they matter more to me than you probably know. Thank you for staying until the very last word with me. There are more of these stories ahead, and I hope, if this one meant something to you, you'll be here for the next.